Tonight, we're going to talk about something that sounds dramatic, intense, and deeply alarming, but we're going to talk about it in the calmest possible way. So dim the lights, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, and let your brain slowly power down while we wander through one of history's most misunderstood traditions. This is the story of why samurai ended their own lives. Not suddenly, not impulsively, but through a long, carefully constructed ritual called seppuku. And yes, it's exactly as serious as it sounds, but also far more bureaucratic, socially awkward, and oddly formal than movies ever bother to show, because of course it is. Before we begin, let's get one thing out of the way. This is not going to be graphic, this is not going to be shocking, and this is definitely not going to be exciting. This is sleepy history, slow history, history that gently explains how an entire warrior class collectively decided that dignity was more important than, well, everything else. So if your thoughts start drifting halfway through a sentence, you're doing it right. Let's ease into it. To understand seppuku, we need to start with the samurai themselves. Not the sword-swinging movie version or the dramatic anime version, but the real ones. The samurai were, at their core, professional warriors, but they were also administrators, land managers, poets, and calligraphers, men who could quote philosophy while wearing armor. And like many elite groups in history, they were deeply concerned with one thing above all else: reputation. Not happiness, not comfort, even survival. Reputation. In feudal Japan, your name mattered more than your lifespan. Your family's honor mattered more than your individual body, and public shame was not something you simply worked through. It was something that followed you quietly forever. This is where seppuku enters the story. Seppuku was not originally about punishment, despair, or emotion in the modern sense. It was about control. Control over how you were remembered, control over your final moment, and perhaps most importantly, control over your narrative. Dying on your own terms was considered far better than living while embarrassed, which, when you think about it, is a very specific set of priorities. The roots of seppuku go back centuries, long before it became a formalized ritual. Early samurai culture valued bravery in battle above all else, and being captured alive was considered unfortunate, not immoral or evil, just deeply inconvenient for your family. In the chaos of medieval warfare, some warriors chose to die rather than be taken prisoner. This wasn't ceremonial or poetic, it was practical. But as Japanese society became more structured, so did its ideas about honor. By the time of the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, the samurai class had developed what became known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. It wasn't a single rule book, but a loose collection of expectations, philosophies, and unspoken agreements. Be loyal, be disciplined, be calm, be willing to die at any moment, and above all, do not disgrace yourself. Seppuku became the ultimate expression of that mindset, a way to say, I acknowledge failure, but I refuse humiliation, which is a very samurai sentence. Seppuku was not something you decided to do on a random afternoon. It usually followed a specific trigger: losing a battle, failing a lord, or being ordered to do it. Yes, sometimes seppuku was mandatory, and strangely enough, that was considered merciful. Execution was public, messy, and embarrassing, while seppuku allowed the condemned to die with dignity, at home, surrounded by witnesses, with posture intact. If a shogun ordered you to commit seppuku, the message was essentially, you messed up, but we still respect your family name, which is oddly polite given the circumstances. The ritual itself followed a careful structure. First came bathing, followed by the selection of clean clothes, usually white, symbolizing purity, calm, and emotional clarity, not fear or mourning, just readiness. Then came the writing of a death poem,
because, of course, the warrior class that practiced ritual self-ending also insisted on ending things with poetry. These poems were short and restrained, often referencing nature, falling leaves, morning dew, the moon, with no ranting, blaming, or dramatic goodbyes, just a final aesthetic thought before exiting history. The setting was equally formal. The samurai would kneel on a mat with a small blade placed in front of them, and behind them stood another samurai known as the kaishakunin. Their role was supportive in a very specific way, ensuring the ritual did not drag on. This person was carefully chosen, often a close friend, and it was not an easy job. Doing it incorrectly would be extremely awkward and deeply dishonorable, so there was no pressure at all. Popular culture often exaggerates seppuku as prolonged, excruciating, and theatrical, but by later periods it was highly controlled and intentionally brief. The blade was symbolic, the act formal. The goal was not suffering, but demonstration of resolve, composure, and obedience to a moral code that demanded calm even at the end, which is frankly exhausting just to think about. Seppuku was not about wanting to die, it was about refusing to live under dishonor. Samurai were raised from childhood to believe that shame was worse than death, that loyalty mattered more than personal desire, and that dignity was something you guarded with your life, literally. This mindset was reinforced through education, stories, and family expectations, so by adulthood, seppuku wasn't terrifying, it was familiar, always present as a quiet option, which is a lot to carry around emotionally. As centuries passed and Japan entered the relatively peaceful Edo period, large-scale warfare declined, but the ritual remained. Traditions rarely disappeared just because they're no longer practical. Instead, seppuku became a moral statement, a symbolic gesture, and sometimes even a political protest. A samurai could use it to criticize authority, express loyalty, or make a final point that could not be ignored. History is strange like that. The quietly tragic part is that many samurai who committed seppuku were not criminals or failures by modern standards. They were victims of rigid systems, inherited expectations, and a culture that prized appearance over inner life. Their personal feelings didn't really matter. What mattered was how things looked, a problem elite societies throughout history seem to repeat in different outfits.
As this story continues, it will drift into specific cases, famous samurai, political incidents, and moments when seppuku became a national conversation rather than a private ritual. It will explore loyalty taken to uncomfortable extremes, orders that left no room for negotiation, and how this tradition eventually faded, slowly, awkwardly, and not without resistance. For now, though, it's a good place to pause, letting thoughts slow down and the atmosphere settle, before gently floating into the age where seppuku became less about war and more about social expectations that nobody really knew how to escape. So let's gently pick up where we left off, in a Japan that is oddly calm, too calm actually, because by the time we reach the Edo period in the early 1600s, Japan isn't constantly on fire anymore. The wars have mostly stopped, the Tokugawa shogunate has things under control, roads are safer, castles are quieter, and the samurai are still there, still armed, still extremely proud, but without much to do, which is never a great situation for a warrior class. During this long stretch of peace, samurai slowly transform from battlefield professionals into administrators, becoming officials, bureaucrats, and managers of land and rice stipends who write reports, attend meetings, argue over protocol, and still carry swords all the time because tradition, creating a strange tension where men raised to define themselves through death, loyalty, and readiness now live in a society where actual combat is rare, forcing them to look for other ways to prove honor. This is where seppuku quietly shifts from a response to battlefield failure or capture into a social tool, a moral punctuation mark, a calm and polite way of saying, I take this issue so seriously that I am willing to end my existence over it, complete with paperwork, because by the Edo period, seppuku often required official permission, sometimes even a formal request explaining why one intended to die with dignity. And in other cases, it was ordered as a sentence framed as a privilege, with dates set, witnesses assigned, emotions restrained, and acceptance expected. Loyalty sits at the center of all this, as samurai were bound to their lords above family, survival, and common sense, a deeply personal exchange of land, income, and status for obedience, service, and, if necessary, life itself. An arrangement that grew complicated when lords died and practices like junshi emerged, where retainers followed their lord into death not by order but by expectation, even when discouraged or banned, because cultural pressure outweighed rules, and living on meant enduring whispers that could be unbearable. This tension reaches its most famous expression in the early 1700s with Asano Naganori, who, while performing ceremonial duties under the guidance of the unpopular and humiliating court official Kida Yoshinaka, finally snapped and attacked him inside the shogun's palace, an unforgivable breach regardless of motive, leading to Asano's immediate and formal seppuku, the confiscation of his lands, the disgrace of his family, and the transformation of his followers into ronin. What followed was not action, but nearly 2 years of waiting, planning, and pretending to move on, as these former retainers took humble jobs and acted harmless while quietly preparing for revenge, not to escape, but to complete a moral equation. When they finally killed Kida, they turned themselves in, forcing the shogunate into a dilemma that ended in a compromise. The ronin were ordered to commit seppuku, an outcome seen as honorable and later immortalized as the story of the 47 ronin, retold endlessly to teach loyalty, patience, self-control, and the willingness to die quietly when required. Yet beneath this noble image lay a softer, sadder reality, as many samurai felt trapped by ideals they could not escape, maintaining appearances in a peaceful world where honor was fragile, and a single mistake or political shift could end with a polite suggestion that seppuku might be appropriate, a suggestion that was difficult to refuse. By the late Edo period, some thinkers cautiously questioned whether loyalty without reason was virtuous, or whether dying for symbolism served anyone at all. But traditions built over centuries lingered, whispered, and reminded people of what was expected, setting the stage for a modern era where seppuku would struggle to survive in a changing Japan shaped by Western influence, new laws, new values, and an ancient ritual trying very hard to remain relevant as the world moved on. Into a Japan that is changing whether it wants to or not, because eventually history does that thing where it knocks politely at the door and then kicks it in anyway. By the mid-1800s, Japan is still officially closed to most of the outside world. The Tokugawa shogunate has maintained peace for over 2 centuries. Samurai still exist, castles still stand, everything looks stable, which is usually the historical cue that it's not. In 1853, foreign ships appear off the coast, large ones, black-hulled, very modern. They belong to the United States Navy under Commodore Perry. Perry politely demands that Japan open its ports, and by politely we mean with cannons. This moment sends a shock through Japanese society, because suddenly centuries of tradition are facing steam power, and tradition does not enjoy that matchup. Over the next few decades, Japan begins to transform rapidly. The shogunate collapses, the Meiji Restoration begins, power shifts back to the emperor, and with this shift comes something deeply unsettling for the samurai class. They are slowly, politely phased out. Their stipends reduced, their privileges revoked, their swords eventually banned in public. The warrior elite becomes unnecessary, which is a terrible thing to say to people raised on honor-based identity. This period is deeply uncomfortable for samurai. Some adapt. They become teachers, officials, businessmen.
Others don't, because adaptation requires flexibility, and rigid traditions are not known for that. Seppuku by this point is no longer legally sanctioned. The new government wants to modernize, to look civilized by Western standards. Public ritual self-ending does not fit the aesthetic. So officially, seppuku is abolished. Unofficially, it lingers. For some former samurai, seppuku becomes an act of resistance, a way to protest modernization, a way to say these values still matter even if you don't want them anymore. It becomes symbolic again, not widespread, not encouraged, but deeply meaningful to those who cling to it. One of the most famous examples occurs in 1877, the Satsuma Rebellion. Former samurai, led by Saigo Takamori, rise up against the government. Saigo is often romanticized as the last true samurai, which is a title that tends to end badly. The rebellion fails, and Saigo dies shortly afterwards.
The exact details are debated, but traditional accounts say he died by seppuku, assisted by a companion. Whether literal or symbolic, the story resonated. It marked an ending, the quiet closing of an era. After this point, seppuku fades from everyday life, but it does not disappear from memory. It becomes something taught, referenced, evoked, a historical ideal rather than a common practice. And then, in the 20th century, it reappears, briefly, uneasily. During World War II, elements of samurai ideology are revived, not organically, but intentionally. The state promotes ideas of sacrifice, loyalty, and honor for soldiers, for pilots, for civilians. Seppuku, while not common, is referenced as a historical precedent, a symbol of commitment to something greater than oneself, which history tends to do when it wants people to stop asking questions. A few individuals choose seppuku during this era, not because it is required, but because it feels meaningful to them. One of the most well-known cases occurs in 1970, a writer named Yukio Mishima. Mishima is many things: brilliant, controversial, deeply fixated on traditional masculinity and honor. He stages a dramatic protest against modern Japan and then commits seppuku, publicly, intentionally. It shocks the country, because by this point, seppuku feels archaic, out of place, almost unreal. And yet, there it is. Mishima's death forces Japan to confront the lingering power of old ideals, the fact that even in a modern industrial society, some traditions still whisper. They don't command anymore, but they remember. Today, seppuku exists as history, as literature, as film, as a symbol discussed in classrooms. It is not practiced, it is not encouraged, and yet it remains one of the most distinctive examples of how culture can shape ideas about life and death. Not through chaos, but through structure. Not through impulse, but through expectation. And that's the quiet truth of seppuku. It was never about pain. It was about meaning. It was about controlling how a life ended in a world that left very little room for personal choice. So as we slowly come to rest here, let this be the final thought drifting through your mind tonight. Cultures teach us what to value, sometimes gently, sometimes relentlessly. And once those values are absorbed, they can be very hard to let go of, even when the world has already moved on. So now we're at the end of the long road, not with a dramatic finale or a revelation, but with the slow administrative fade-out of a tradition that once carried enormous weight, which honestly feels appropriate. Because seppuku didn't end in a single moment, it dissolved quietly and unevenly, with many people unsure what to replace it with. By the late 20th century, seppuku had become something you read about rather than something you expected to encounter, living in textbooks, historical dramas, and the occasional newspaper headline that made everyone uncomfortable for a few days.
The Japanese legal system no longer recognized it. The military no longer referenced it officially, and schools taught it as a cultural artifact, something that once made sense in a world that no longer exists. Yet it still lingered in conversations about identity, duty, and responsibility, because traditions like this don't vanish completely. They leave impressions. One of the most important shifts in how seppuku was understood came when historians and psychologists began looking back without romantic filters. Earlier retellings framed it as noble, pure,
and disciplined, while later interpretations became more cautious, asking who benefited from the system, who felt pressured into it, and how much choice was actually involved. When a culture presents death as the most honorable solution, the alternatives become very narrow, and modern scholars often describe seppuku as a form of socially enforced self-destruction, not impulsive or emotional, but methodical, the result of lifelong conditioning. It stands as a reminder that honor cultures don't just guide behavior, they trap it. Because once shame is taught as unbearable, people will do almost anything to avoid it, even disappear. This is where the story becomes less about samurai and more about humans. Because while seppuku is uniquely Japanese in form, the underlying logic is universal. Throughout history, elites everywhere have invented ways to ritualize failure. Romans fell on swords. Medieval nobles drank poison. Officers chose so-called honorable exits. Different aesthetics, the same discomfort with disgrace. What made seppuku stand out was its structure. It wasn't secretive or chaotic. It was witnessed, observed, and recorded, reinforcing the lesson that everyone saw what happened when honor was lost. Everyone understood the expectations, and once expectations are understood, they begin to enforce themselves. By the time Japan fully entered the modern global order, this system became unsustainable. Industrial life values productivity over symbolism. Bureaucracies prefer rehabilitation to ritual endings, and modern states need living workers, not poetic conclusions. So the old logic slowly lost its footing, not because people stopped caring about dignity, but because they began defining it differently. Today, seppuku is usually discussed with distance, combining respect for historical context with discomfort, an awareness that the tradition demanded silence when compassion may have been needed, that it elevated appearance over inner suffering, and that it asked individuals to solve systemic problems by removing themselves, which is never a strong long-term strategy. And yet there remains something strangely hypnotic about it, the discipline, the calm, the refusal to panic. Not because it should be admired, but because it reveals how powerful cultural narratives can be, and how completely they shape behavior, even at the very end. Seppuku teaches that humans are willing to endure extraordinary things if they believe it gives meaning to their existence, showing how identity can become so tightly bound to role and expectation that life without them feels impossible. It reminds us that progress often begins not by erasing the past, but by slowly and awkwardly learning how to live without it. The samurai are gone now, their castles turned into museums, their armor resting behind glass, their swords carefully labeled, and seppuku exists only as an echo, a reminder of a world where honor weighed more than survival, and where the quietest ending was considered the strongest statement, not because it was right, but because everyone believed it was necessary. That is where this story truly ends, not with the ritual itself,
but with the realization that cultures can convince people to carry astonishing burdens, as long as those burdens are framed as virtues. Something history repeats again and again, only with different costumes, different rules, and different definitions of what it means to be worthy. That's the full arc.
We're talking about what actually happened during a Victorian asylum evaluation, not the dramatic movie version, not the screaming chains on the wall version, but the real paperwork-heavy, deeply awkward, quietly unsettling reality. Because if there's one thing the Victorians loved almost as much as lace curtains and moral panic, it was deciding that other people were unwell. So imagine it. It's the mid to late 1800s. You're tired, you're sad, you talk to yourself a bit, you cry at inconvenient times. You're a woman who disagrees with her husband, or a man who doesn't like his job, or honestly just someone who's poor and loud about it. Congratulations, you're about to be evaluated. And when we say evaluation, don't picture a calm therapist with a clipboard asking about your childhood. Picture instead a gentleman in a stiff coat who has already decided the outcome and is mostly here to justify it in writing. Victorian asylum evaluations were not medical in the way we'd recognize today. They were social judgments dressed up as science. And the science, such as it was enthusiastic, very confident, and wrong in fascinating ways. The process usually began not with a doctor, but with a complaint from a family member, a spouse, an employer, sometimes a landlord who was tired of late rent and loud opinions, reporting that someone was behaving strangely. And strangely was a very flexible word that could mean hallucinating, but could also mean refusing to eat meat, reading too much or not enough, believing in the wrong religion or believing too strongly in the right one, with at least one Victorian doctor seriously listing excessive religious enthusiasm as a symptom of insanity. Once the complaint was lodged, the wheels began to turn slowly, with paperwork, so much paperwork. And before someone could be committed, that usually needed certification by one or two physicians who didn't need to be mental health specialists, just doctors, or sometimes merely respected men with medical titles and confidence. The evaluation itself was often shockingly brief, sometimes less than 15 minutes, with an entire mental state being decided faster than a modern coffee order. The doctor would arrive, often at the patient's home, sit, observe, ask a few unsubtle questions like whether you believed yourself noble, heard voices, thought people were watching you, or whether you respected your husband, obeyed your father, and understood your proper place in society, with wrong answers carefully noted. But the patient's answers mattered far less than the doctor's interpretation of them. Calm meant deceptively rational. Emotional meant hysteria. Anger at being evaluated meant obvious insanity, creating a beautifully closed system of circular logic where protest proved illness and silence proved emotional deficiency, either way ending in commitment. Doctors took notes on posture, eye contact, tone of voice, and whether the patient smiled appropriately. Too much smiling was suspicious, too little was melancholia, neutral was blank. There was no winning, only documentation. Women were evaluated differently, meaning much worse, with everything filtered through reproductive health, so anxiety became uterine irritation, depression uterine exhaustion, anger displaced womb energy, intelligence potentially dangerous, and menstruation discussed in uncomfortable detail in front of male relatives or strangers, where irregular cycles were evidence and regular cycles could also be evidence. Women who had recently given birth were especially vulnerable, with postpartum depression unrecognized and instead labeled moral weakness or madness, allowing exhausted, recovering women to be certified and institutionalized. Once certified, evaluation didn't stop. It relocated to the asylum, where intake examinations were longer, more invasive, and somehow less empathetic, including skull measurements thanks to lingering phrenology, with head shape supposedly revealing aggression, intelligence, and moral fiber, eyes examined, teeth inspected, skin tone noted, and every possible presentation interpreted as pathology. Personal and family histories were recorded, with any relative who drank too much, behaved oddly, or had strong opinions retroactively diagnosed, because madness was believed inherited, making even an uncle yelling at a cow relevant.
Education level was judged too, with too little suggesting inferiority and too much mental strain, especially for women, while life stories were filtered through expectations, so slow speech meant dullness, fast speech agitation, hesitation confusion, articulation manipulation, again with no winning. Moral reasoning was tested through hypotheticals about found money, where wrong answers were wrong and correct answers delivered too confidently were also wrong, while social interaction was scrutinized, so politeness, withdrawal, friendliness, introversion, and extroversion could all be pathologized. Sexual behavior obsessed them, particularly masturbation, with awkward euphemistic questioning and any suspicion of self-abuse considered a serious cause of mental illness, because Victorians genuinely believed sexual thought could rot the brain. Sleep patterns were evaluated. Insomnia was a symptom, oversleeping was a symptom, normal sleep was deceptive calm. Diet was scrutinized, vegetarianism suspicious, overeating indulgent, undereating melancholia, and throughout it all, the patient's voice was secondary at best. Doctors wrote in confident Latin-heavy prose that followed people for years, clear signs of moral insanity, hereditary degeneracy, lack of appropriate emotional response. And once inside the system, reevaluation was rare, with release requiring proof of sanity to the same system that labeled you insane, like asking a locked door for permission to unlock itself. So, that's the beginning. The quiet paperwork, the polite questions, the calm voices deciding your fate. And for now, let that settle. A room, a doctor, a pen scratching notes, and a life slowly being reclassified.
All right, let's just ease back in. You've been evaluated, certified, your name written neatly into a ledger, and now the carriage ride is over. You are inside the asylum. Victorian asylums loved to describe themselves as places of rest, retreats, sanctuaries for troubled minds, which is a lovely thought if you don't look too closely at the details, because once inside, you were never really off the record again. The evaluation didn't end, it simply became ambient. From the moment a patient arrived, they were observed, quietly, constantly, like a very boring nature documentary where nothing exciting was allowed to happen. Attendants watched how you walked down the corridor. Did you hesitate? Did you drag your feet? Did you look around too much? All of that went into the file. Your room, if you were lucky enough to have one, was sparse. Bed, chair, maybe a small table. No sharp edges, no privacy. With doors that often had observation panels, just a little window, enough to remind you that someone could be watching, or not watching, which was somehow worse. Patients were evaluated on how they adapted to the routine, and routine was the true ruler of asylum life. Wake up at the bell, wash, dress, line up, eat, work, eat again, rest, sleep. And any deviation from this rhythm was noted. Struggle to wake up and you were sluggish. Wake too early and you were restless. Follow the routine perfectly and you might be mechanical, which was also a problem. Meals were especially important because doctors loved watching people eat. Eating eagerly suggested animal appetites. Eating slowly meant melancholia. Refusing food was resisting treatment, and sometimes patients were force-fed, not as punishment officially, but as moral correction, under the simple logic that if the body could be controlled, the mind would follow. Work was another major point of observation, under the belief in productive labor, men in gardens, workshops, or farms, women sewing, cleaning, cooking, or doing laundry. But the reaction mattered more than the task. Diligence showed improvement. Too much enthusiasm suggested manic energy. Resistance meant defiance, leading to notes like, "Patient applies herself to sewing with excessive intensity," an incredible sentence to imagine someone writing seriously. Silence was especially valued. Quiet patients were considered calm, or broken, or cunningly sane. Talking too much was a red flag. Talking too little was withdrawal. And talking the wrong way, too poetic, too emotional, too intellectual, was suspicious. So patients learned quickly that speaking less was safer, many stopping altogether, which was then recorded as emotional flattening,
conveniently confirming the diagnosis. Daily walks were common in better-funded asylums because fresh air was believed to be therapeutic, but patients were watched even then. Did they walk alone, group together, laugh? Because laughing without a clear cause was a symptom, and laughing at the wrong thing was also a symptom. Friendships were discouraged. Strong emotional bonds, seen as unhealthy attachments. Sit together too often and attendance separated you because dependency was bad, but isolation was also bad, again leaving no winning outcome. Doctors conducted regular reviews, which were not conversations but performances. A patient was summoned, seated, asked a few questions like, "How do you feel today? Do you understand why you are here? Do you still believe your former ideas?" With the correct answer usually being gratitude and improvement, but not too much gratitude because that looked insincere. Claim improvement, and the doctor might note, claims improvement though likely lacks insight. Say you feel the same, and it was no progress observed. Say you felt worse, and it became condition deteriorating. These reviews determined privileges, more freedom, less supervision, better work, but privileges could be revoked at any time without explanation. Sleep became another obsession because doctors believed it was the gateway to mental health. Those who slept poorly were watched closely. Those who slept deeply were also watched because excessive sleep suggested mental collapse, with night attendants recording movement, sleep talking, and restlessness, leading some patients to lie perfectly still for hours just to avoid being noted. And the boredom, intentional, profound, because stimulation was thought to aggravate illness. So books were few, conversation limited, tasks repetitive, boredom allegedly therapeutic, and patients who complained were labeled ungrateful, entitled, or overly focused on pleasure. Entertainment, when allowed, was tightly controlled. Music played but never exciting, no fast rhythms, while religious services were common and often mandatory, where too much enthusiasm was a symptom and too little was moral deficiency, so patients sat, stared, and sang quietly. All of this fed into the ongoing evaluation, every note, every glance, every sigh, because there was no neutral behavior, and even improvement was dangerous, since those who appeared too normal too quickly were suspected of deception, doctors fearing malingering, so patients were kept longer just to be sure. Months became years, years became decades, with some entering as teenagers and leaving as elderly people if they left at all. Family visits were sometimes allowed, but families could also block release, especially if the patient had embarrassed them, challenged authority, or inherited money. And doctors often deferred to families because families paid the bills, making sanity not just medical, but social, economic, and convenient. Through it all, the evaluation continued as a living document, always growing and never forgiving, until all that remained was the quiet. Footsteps in a hallway, a bell ringing, a pen moving across paper, and a life being slowly, politely observed. By now, you've probably noticed that Victorian asylums ran less on treatment and more on vocabulary. If there was one thing Victorian psychiatry truly loved, it was a good label.
Labels were comforting. They turned messy human behavior into neat categories, gave doctors authority, and looked impressive in handwritten ledgers. Once a patient was inside the asylum, the next major phase of evaluation was diagnostic labeling. This process wasn't about understanding the person, it was about deciding which box they fit into, and there were many boxes. One of the most popular labels was melancholia. Melancholia was the Victorian word for sadness, but not just sadness. Any prolonged emotional heaviness qualified. Grief that lasted too long, lack of motivation, quiet despair. If you cried frequently, it was melancholia. If you didn't cry at all, it was still melancholia. If you stared out of windows, that counted too. People who had lost children, spouses, livelihoods, or entire futures were often labeled melancholic rather than grieving. Grief was expected to be temporary, and if it lingered, it became pathological. Doctors described melancholic patients as slow, heavy, and withdrawn.
writing observations such as, "Patient sits for long periods in silence, absorbed in morbid reflection," which sounds suspiciously like thinking. Treatment for melancholia often involved forced cheerfulness, work, routine, cold baths, fresh air, and sometimes opiates, because that was considered helpful for long-term emotional health. Then there was mania. Mania didn't mean joy, it meant excess. Excess energy, excess speech, excess confidence. If a patient talked quickly, laughed loudly, gestured too much, or held strong opinions, they could be labeled manic. Political passion could be mania, artistic enthusiasm could be mania, and anger at confinement was definitely mania. Doctors wrote about manic patients with weary disdain, noting things like, "Patient speaks incessantly and resists authority." Mania was treated with restraint, literally. Physical restraint was still common in many asylums, despite claims of reform. Straps, isolation rooms, or simply being tied to a chair until the patient calmed down were all standard practices, and this was often recorded as progress. The most vague and most dangerous category of all was moral insanity. Moral insanity wasn't about losing touch with reality, it was about behaving badly, or more accurately, behaving in ways that made society uncomfortable. A morally insane person could reason clearly, speak well, and understand consequences, they just didn't conform. People labeled morally insane were often described as selfish, manipulative, or untrustworthy. Women who had affairs, men who gambled, and people who didn't feel shame about the right things all fell into this category. Doctors believed these individuals had intact intellects but defective moral faculties, which was a polite way of saying, "We don't like your personality." Once labeled morally insane, release was rare because there was no clear way to prove that one's morals had improved. Hysteria was another common diagnosis, and it was the all-purpose label for women, especially inconvenient ones. Symptoms included anxiety, mood swings, sexual desire, sexual disinterest, strong opinions, and weak opinions. Hysteria could appear as fainting, crying, anger, silence, or laughter. It was tied, as always, to the uterus and the myth of the wandering womb. Doctors believed hysteria was caused by reproductive dysfunction, sexual frustration, or excessive emotion. Treatment included rest cures, isolation, and forced bed rest. Some women were confined to dark rooms and forbidden from reading or writing because thinking was considered overstimulating. A hysteria diagnosis often followed women for life, even after release, leaving their emotions permanently suspect. There were also more specific labels, such as monomania. Monomania meant being obsessed with one idea. A man who believed he was wronged by his employer, a woman who believed her husband mistreated her, or anyone who fixated on injustice could be diagnosed with it. Doctors viewed these beliefs not as possible truths, but pathological fixations. If you were angry about one thing for too long, that thing became your diagnosis. Dementia was another label, though it didn't mean what it means today. Victorian dementia referred broadly to mental decline and was often applied to elderly patients, but also to younger individuals who became withdrawn or unresponsive. Trauma, depression, and even institutionalization itself could be labeled as dementia. Once diagnosed, hope for recovery dropped sharply because decline was assumed to be inevitable. Doctors also loved inventing subcategories: melancholia with stupor, mania with delusions, hysteria with convulsions. The more complex the label, the more impressive it looked in reports, and reports mattered. Asylums were constantly inspected, and doctors needed to appear competent, so they wrote endlessly. Patient case histories became long narratives filtered entirely through the doctor's voice, and patients rarely recognized themselves in these accounts. A woman who refused to eat because the food made her ill became willfully obstinate. A man who protested unfair confinement became argumentative and delusional. Language shaped reality. Once a label was applied, everything the patient did was interpreted through it. A melancholic patient smiling was a sign of instability. A manic patient sitting quietly was suspicious, and a hysterical patient being calm was deceptive. The diagnosis swallowed the person. Even recovery was defined narrowly. Recovery meant obedience, routine, and compliance, not happiness or fulfillment, just manageability. And so the evaluation continued through words, labels, and confident handwriting. In the next part, the focus would turn to treatments, what doctors believed would cure these conditions: cold water, electricity, rest cures, and a great deal of well-meaning harm. But for now, it ends quietly, with a stack of files, a shelf of names, and each one reduced to a diagnosis. So now we arrive at the part the Victorians were very proud of: the treatments. Because once someone had been evaluated, labeled, observed, relabeled, and thoroughly written about, the next logical step was to fix them. Victorian psychiatry believed deeply in intervention, not necessarily effective intervention, but visible intervention. Something had to be done, preferably something that looked scientific. One of the earliest and most beloved treatments was the cold bath. Cold water was considered bracing, clarifying, morally corrective. Patients were immersed in cold water for minutes at a time, sometimes longer, sometimes until they stopped resisting. The theory was simple: shock the body, reset the mind. In practice, it mostly terrified people. Doctors noted reactions carefully. If a patient panicked, that was proof of instability. If a patient endured it calmly, that was emotional dullness. Again, there was no winning. There was also the continuous bath, which sounds nicer than it was. Patients were placed in warm water for hours, sometimes days. They were fed in the bath, restrained in the bath, observed in the bath. This was meant to soothe agitation, and occasionally it did. More often, it just dissolved the sense of time. Then there was restraint, which reformers claimed had been eliminated but quietly remained in use. Straitjackets, lever straps, chairs designed to hold the body still. Restraint was always described as temporary, always therapeutic, never punitive, officially. Patients restrained for long periods often became quieter, withdrawn, compliant. Doctors called this improvement. Work therapy continued alongside these treatments. The belief was that structured labor would rebuild moral character. Patients scrubbed floors, tended fields, mended clothes. If they worked without complaint, progress was noted. If they resisted, more treatment followed. Some asylums prided themselves on being self-sustaining, which meant patient labor wasn't just therapeutic, it was convenient. Then came electrical treatments. Electricity was new, modern, exciting. Doctors applied electrical currents to the scalp, spine, or limbs. The idea was to stimulate the nervous system. Patients often found it painful or frightening, or both. But pain was not considered a downside. Pain was instructive. Doctors wrote about electricity with great optimism, sometimes even when it did nothing. And if a patient deteriorated afterward, that was simply the illness progressing. Medication existed, though not as we know it. Opiates were common, sedatives like chloral hydrate, alcohol occasionally as a calming agent. These drugs made patients quieter, sleepier, easier to manage. This, too, was improvement. One of the most infamous treatments was the rest cure. Patients, mostly women, were confined to bed, forbidden from reading, writing, talking too much. They were fed rich foods, milk, meat broths. The goal was to rebuild strength by removing all stimulation. Some women spent months staring at ceilings, losing muscle, losing identity. Doctors described successful rest cures as producing docile, calm patients. Patients described them very differently, but patient voices rarely made it into official records. And that's the important thing to understand about Victorian asylum evaluations. They didn't really end. There was no final assessment where someone declared, "You are now well." Instead, there was a gradual fading. If a patient adapted, stopped resisting, learned the rules, they might be granted parole, short walks outside the grounds, supervised visits, eventually perhaps discharge. But discharge did not erase the diagnosis. Former patients returned to society labeled as fragile, unstable, always watched. Families often treated them differently, more cautiously, more controlling. Employment was difficult, marriage complicated. The evaluation followed them invisibly. For those who didn't adapt, who couldn't become quiet enough, compliant enough, manageable enough, the asylum became permanent. These patients aged inside institutions, watched attendance come and go, watched reforms announced and forgotten. Their files grew thicker, their names more faded. By the late Victorian period, some doctors began to notice a problem. Patients weren't getting better. Asylums were overcrowded, staff exhausted, treatments repetitive. Some doctors blamed heredity, degeneration, the moral weakness of society. Others quietly suspected the system itself might be part of the illness. But systems rarely diagnose themselves. Evaluations continued well into the early 20th century, slowly changing language, slowly updating methods, but the core remained: authority judging behavior, paper defining reality. Eventually, psychiatry moved on. New theories, new drugs, new words. Victorian evaluations were criticized, re-examined, archived, but their legacy lingered. Because they taught society something dangerous, that deviation could be medicalized, that inconvenience could be diagnosed, that authority could define sanity. And for the people who lived through it, the evaluation was not a moment. It was a slow erasure, a life reduced to observations, reactions, compliance. Not madness as chaos, but madness as paperwork. And that's actually what happened during a Victorian asylum evaluation. Not screaming corridors, not constant violence, but quiet rooms, confident doctors, and endless notes deciding who you were allowed to be. And then eventually the file was closed, not because the story ended, but because there was nothing more the system wanted to ask.
We're talking about life as a eunuch in China's Forbidden City, a world defined by power, pain, and politics, and by long hours spent standing very quietly in hallways while pretending not to exist. It's one of those historical subjects that sounds dramatic at first, but the longer you stay with it, the more strangely routine it becomes, which is exactly what makes it such perfect bedtime material. When people hear Forbidden City, they usually imagine golden roofs, massive gates, dragon carvings, and emperors staring moodily into the middle distance. All of that was real, but the Forbidden City was also a workplace, a very large one, with thousands of employees. Among the most important of those employees were the eunuchs, men who had been surgically altered so they could be trusted around the imperial family, because nothing says loyal servant like removing the possibility of heirs entirely. The logic, at least on paper, was simple. No biological family meant no competing loyalties, no risk of sneaking off with a concubine and accidentally founding a rival dynasty. Problem solved. History, of course, immediately responded with, "That's adorable, but no." Eunuchs had existed in China for more than 2,000 years before the Forbidden City was even built, serving in palaces and noble households long before Beijing became the capital. The Ming and Qing dynasties, however, truly perfected the system. By the time the Forbidden City was fully operational, eunuchs were everywhere, tens of thousands of them, running errands, guarding doors, delivering messages, managing food, laundry, rituals, and most importantly, access. That last responsibility was where things became interesting. Emperors were secluded figures, wrapped in ceremony and buried beneath layers of protocol thicker than palace walls. If you wanted to reach the Son of Heaven, chances were you had to go through a eunuch first. And if history teaches us anything, it's that gatekeepers eventually realize they are powerful. Becoming a eunuch was not a career you casually stumbled into. Some were captured as children during wars, some sold by desperate families during famines. Some were criminals offered a grim alternative to execution. Others volunteered, which is always the hardest part to understand. Usually because palace service promised food, shelter, and stability in times when starvation or banditry were the only real alternatives. The procedure itself was comprehensive. This was not partial castration. It was everything, politely referred to as the 3-inch treasure, a euphemism that only bureaucracy could invent.
It was performed by specialists, and survival was not guaranteed. Infection was common, pain was constant, and recovery took months. Those who survived were officially eunuchs. Those who didn't were quietly erased from the historical record. Successful eunuchs were required to keep their removed parts in a special container, believing they would need them intact in the afterlife to be whole again. Palace inspections sometimes included checking that this container was still there, because history, if nothing else, is committed to details. Once admitted into palace service, a eunuch entered a world that was rigid and strangely informal at the same time. There were ranks, rules, uniforms, and endless rituals. But there was also gossip, favor trading, quiet alliances in corridors, and long nights waiting outside doors that would never open. Most eunuchs lived entirely within the palace walls. The Forbidden City wasn't just their workplace, it was their entire universe. Birthdays, festivals, illnesses, and deaths all happened inside. They slept in cramped quarters, ate simple food, and learned early that invisibility was a survival skill. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not look directly at superiors. You did not exist unless needed. But once you were needed, everything changed. Eunuchs handled the intimate details of imperial life, dressing the emperor, bringing meals, delivering private messages, managing schedules. When an emperor trusted you, that trust could become extremely valuable. This was especially true when emperors were young, isolated, or uninterested in governing, which happened more often than official histories like to admit. Some emperors preferred poetry, some alchemy, and some preferred doing absolutely nothing at all. In those moments, eunuchs stepped in. Over time, they began to control access to the throne, filtering information, deciding which petitions were read, which officials were granted audiences, and which warnings mysteriously vanished. Because eunuchs technically had no families, emperors often trusted them more than scholar officials who had clans and ambitions. Eunuchs, in theory, had nothing. In practice, they had everything. One of the great contradictions of palace life was that eunuchs were socially despised and politically feared at the same time. Confucian scholars saw them as unnatural and morally suspect, a threat to proper order, which did absolutely nothing to stop them from accumulating influence. During the Ming Dynasty, eunuchs were officially banned from learning to read, since literacy was power, and the court assumed this would prevent problems. Naturally, many eunuchs learned to read anyway. Some became highly educated, some ran intelligence networks, and some even commanded armies. Eunuchs couldn't inherit land or legally have children, but they could build patronage networks, adopt nephews, and funnel wealth to allies. Gifts, bribes, tribute, silk, and silver flowed constantly through the palace, and eunuchs, who handled logistics, inevitably handled power as well. For most eunuchs, however, life was not luxurious. The majority lived hard, quiet lives, with long hours, little recognition, and constant risk. A single mistake could mean beating, exile, or execution. Imperial courts were not known for compassion or workplace protections. Eunuchs were often scapegoated during crises, floods, rebellions, economic collapse, when officials needed someone convenient to blame. Sometimes the accusations were justified, sometimes they weren't. Emperors often allowed it anyway, because it was easier than admitting imperial failure. Despite purges, bans, and moral condemnations, eunuchs never disappeared because the system depended on them. The Forbidden City was too large, too complex, and too obsessed with hierarchy. Someone had to open the doors, pass the messages, and stand quietly at 3 in the morning holding a lantern and waiting for a bell to ring. That someone was usually a eunuch.
Emotionally, eunuch life was deeply complicated. Many were taken as children and raised entirely within palace walls, knowing no other world. Some formed close friendships with fellow eunuchs, some bonded with imperial women, and some developed intense loyalty to a single master. Others grew bitter and resentful, hungry for control in a world that had taken everything else from them. It's not hard to see how that mixture could become volatile, and often it did. For now,
It's enough to pause and imagine the marble courtyard stretching endlessly into the night, the soft shuffle of silk shoes, and the quiet hum of a city designed not to reveal its secrets, but to keep them. Deeper into the Forbidden City, where the lanterns stay lit late and the people who aren't supposed to matter very much do. By this point, our eunuchs are no longer just background furniture. They've figured out where the doors lead, which corridors echo, which officials are impatient, and which emperors would really rather be doing anything else. And that knowledge adds up. Let's start with a simple truth about imperial China. Most emperors were isolated, not just emotionally, but physically, ritually, cosmically. The emperor wasn't just a man, he was the son of heaven, a living bridge between the universe and the tax system, which meant his daily life was wrapped in layers of ceremony so thick that actual human interaction became rare. He woke up according to ritual, ate according to ritual, moved according to ritual, and even relaxed according to ritual. And who managed all of that? Eunuchs. They were the ones who entered the inner palace freely. They were allowed near the imperial women. They handled clothing, medicine, food, messages, and schedules. Scholar officials, by contrast, lived outside the inner court. They submitted memorials, waited, and hoped their paperwork made it through the maze. And somewhere in that maze sat a eunuch, deciding whether the emperor really needed to read this one. At first, eunuchs weren't supposed to have political authority. Confucian ideology was very clear on this. Governance belonged to educated men who had passed exams and memorized classics, not palace servants. So the state created rules. Eunuchs couldn't hold office, couldn't command troops, and couldn't interfere in policy, which is adorable because those rules were enforced by the same palace that relied on eunuchs to function. Over time, emperors began assigning eunuchs temporary tasks. Just help with this report. Just oversee this shipment. Just relay this command. And suddenly, the eunuch was coordinating entire departments. One of the biggest turning points came during periods when emperors were not especially interested in ruling. Some were children, some were sickly, some were deeply invested in personal hobbies like Taoist immortality rituals or collecting rare rocks. When the emperor checked out, someone else had to step in, and often that someone wore soft shoes and spoke quietly. Eunuchs began managing imperial workshops, salt monopolies, tax collection, and military logistics. And because they answered directly to the emperor, they bypassed traditional bureaucracy entirely. Officials hated this, absolutely hated it. From their perspective, years of exams, study, and moral cultivation were being undercut by men who weren't even allowed to grow beards, which, fair enough. But emperors liked eunuchs because eunuchs were useful, loyal, and didn't lecture them about Confucius every 5 minutes. So eunuchs rose, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. By the Ming Dynasty, eunuchs had their own agencies, their own courts, and their own intelligence services. One of the most famous was the Eastern Depot, a secret police organization run entirely by eunuchs, because apparently nothing says good idea like giving a traumatized palace servant an intelligence network. The Eastern Depot monitored officials, investigated corruption, and reported directly to the emperor with no oversight and no appeals. If a eunuch agent showed up at your door, your career was already over. You just didn't know it yet. This kind of power changed people. Some eunuchs genuinely believed they were protecting the dynasty. They saw corrupt officials and lazy governors and thought someone had to keep this thing running. Others enjoyed the perks: silk robes, private estates, adopted heirs, and bribes stacked like firewood. Even though eunuchs couldn't legally have families, many created household networks that functioned exactly like aristocratic clans. They sponsored temples, funded construction projects, and collected favors. And because they lived inside the palace, they controlled information. And information, as always, was everything. The emperor's mother mattered a lot here. Empress dowagers often wielded enormous influence, especially when emperors were young. and eunuchs frequently served as their closest attendants. This created powerful alliances. A eunuch loyal to the Empress Dowager could shape imperial education, access, and perception. He could decide who spoke to the emperor, who was trusted, and who was dangerous. Emperors raised in that environment grew up seeing eunuchs as family, as constants, as people who had always been there. Officials, by contrast, came and went, so loyalty tilted inward. Emotionally, many emperors trusted eunuchs more than anyone else, which, again, makes sense. If you grow up surrounded by people who bow and leave, you cling to the ones who stay. But that trust had consequences. Once a eunuch realized he was indispensable, he could start making demands, subtle ones, quiet ones. A promotion here, a pardon there, a rival quietly reassigned to a distant province. And if an official complained, well, the emperor never saw the complaint. Some eunuchs became legendary for their power, feared, notorious. They built palaces within the palace, commanded troops, and issued orders with imperial seals. And yet their lives were still fragile, because eunuch power depended entirely on imperial favor. Lose that, and everything collapsed. A new emperor could wipe out an entire eunuch faction overnight through executions, confiscations, and public denunciations. History is full of cycles like this. Eunuchs rise, eunuchs fall, officials cheer, and then emperors get lonely again. For the average eunuch, this instability meant living very carefully, choosing alliances cautiously, and avoiding attention when possible. Most never rose beyond basic service. They spent their lives lighting lamps, cleaning halls, and standing still for hours. They aged quickly. Many eunuchs suffered chronic pain from their surgery, infections, urinary problems, and weakness. Medical care existed but was limited, and palace life was physically demanding. Yet for some, palace service was still better than life outside. At least here there was food, shelter, a predictable routine, and sometimes purpose. Many eunuchs took pride in their work. They memorized rituals, perfected movements, and maintained order. They became living components of an enormous machine, a machine that glittered from the outside and ground people quietly within. As the centuries passed, criticism of eunuchs intensified. Confucian scholars wrote essays blaming them for dynastic decline. Moral treatises warned against letting base men near power. Emperors nodded politely and then asked a eunuch to fetch tea, because theory and practice rarely agree. By the time the Qing dynasty took over, the eunuch system was deeply entrenched. Attempts were made to limit numbers, regulate behavior, and reduce influence, and they all failed. The Forbidden City ran on eunuchs, and no one had figured out a replacement. As we drift forward, keep that image in mind. A vast palace, thousands of rooms, echoing courtyards, and moving quietly through it all, men who had lost everything and gained something far more dangerous. We're not chasing emperors or secret police. We're just following an ordinary eunuch through an ordinary day, or as ordinary as anything ever got inside the Forbidden City. Because for every powerful court favorite, there were thousands of men whose entire existence was built out of routine, repetition, and waiting. A eunuch's day started early, painfully early, before sunrise, before the city outside even thought about waking up. Because the palace ran on bells and drums, and when those sounded, you moved. No snoozing, no 5 more minutes. Our eunuch would rise from a narrow bed in a shared dormitory, a simple wooden frame with a thin mattress and no privacy. Wash quickly with cold water, even in winter, especially in winter. Then put on a plain uniform in muted colors, nothing that drew attention, because attention was dangerous. Roll call came next, a supervisor checking names, attendance mattering because absence raised questions, and questions were bad. Assignments varied. Some eunuchs cleaned halls, some tended lamps, some prepared ceremonial objects, some ran messages. The lucky ones worked indoors, the unlucky ones stood guard outside in heat or snow without moving. Silence was a skill. Learning how to walk without sound, how to breathe quietly, how to exist in someone else's peripheral vision without ever entering the center. If you bumped into an official, you bowed. If you bumped into a noblewoman, you bowed deeper. If you bumped into the emperor, that didn't happen, and if it did, you'd already made a catastrophic error. Meals were simple: rice, vegetables, occasionally meat, with no alcohol unless authorized, no wandering, and no personal possessions worth mentioning. Yet within this controlled environment, small economies formed through favor trading and information sharing. Who was angry today? Who was ill? Who had fallen out of favor? Because a whispered warning could save a life. Health was a constant concern, as the surgery left lifelong complications, urinary infections, weakness, pain, and some eunuchs walked with difficulty, some relied on herbal remedies, and some simply endured. Old age was rare, not impossible, but rare. Those who survived long enough sometimes became mentors, training younger eunuchs and passing on unwritten rules about which corridors to avoid, which supervisors to appease, and which doors never opened for anyone. Social bonds mattered, as eunuchs formed tight-knit groups, shared jokes and grievances, using dark, dry humor as a survival mechanism. Then there were the nights, quieter with lantern light and soft footsteps, standing outside doors sometimes for hours, waiting for a bell and listening to muffled voices behind carved wood, learning patience the hard way. Personal desires were complicated, romantic relationships technically forbidden, marriage impossible, yet some eunuchs formed deep emotional attachments anyway, to fellow eunuchs, palace women, or patrons, while others withdrew completely. Religion offered comfort, with many becoming devout Buddhists or Taoists, supporting temples inside and outside the palace with donations, and praying for peace, forgiveness, and wholeness in the next life. Death, when it came, was quiet, a body removed, and a name struck from lists unless you were important, and most weren't. Which is the strange part, because so much of history focuses on the dramatic few, while the Forbidden City existed because of the many, men who woke before dawn, walked silently, and never left. By now, the Forbidden City should feel familiar: the courtyards, the doors, the endless repetition. So in this final stretch, we're not rushing toward a dramatic ending. History rarely ends that cleanly anyway. Instead, we're watching something very old gradually run out of time. Because eunuchs didn't disappear in a single purge or reform, they faded, unevenly, awkwardly, sometimes violently, sometimes bureaucratically, and often while everyone insisted, loudly, that they were absolutely essential. Let's start with the late Qing dynasty. By the 1800s, China was under pressure from every direction: foreign powers, internal rebellions, economic strain. And whenever things went wrong, officials returned to a familiar argument: that the eunuchs were corrupt, that they were interfering, that they were weakening the state. This argument had been made for centuries, but now it landed differently. The Qing court was already unstable. Emperors were younger, regents ruled in their place, and the inner court was a mess of competing factions. Eunuchs still existed, but their power was more fragmented. They were less likely to dominate the entire system and more likely to cluster around individual patrons. Some attached themselves to imperial women, some to princes, some to reform-minded officials who needed inside access. And then there was Empress Dowager Qixi. She is often painted as the ultimate palace manipulator, and while modern historians have softened some of that image, one thing is clear: she understood the value of eunuchs. She relied on them heavily, trusted them, and rewarded loyalty. Under her rule, eunuchs once again gained influence. They managed communications, controlled access, and handled sensitive matters. But even Qixi couldn't stop the tide. By the late 19th century, the imperial system itself was collapsing. Reforms were attempted, institutions were modernized,
And suddenly, a palace full of surgically altered servants looked outdated, uncomfortable, and hard to justify.
Critics now framed eunuchs not just as corrupt, but as symbols of everything wrong with the old order. The Forbidden City, once untouchable, was losing its mystique. Then came the fall. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed, and the last emperor, Puyi, abdicated. Officially, the imperial system was over. But the eunuchs didn't vanish overnight. Puyi was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City for a time, and with him stayed a reduced palace staff, including eunuchs. These final eunuchs lived in a strange limbo. No empire, no future, just habit. They continued their routines, maintained halls, and observed rituals that no longer mattered. Some had spent their entire lives inside the palace and had nowhere else to go. When Puyi was finally expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, the remaining eunuchs were dismissed, given small severance payments, and sent into a world they barely recognized. Many were elderly, sick, and illiterate. Some found work as temple caretakers. Some begged. Some disappeared quietly. A few were interviewed later in life. Their accounts are subdued, practical, almost emotionless. They spoke of routine, of discipline, of long days, not of glory, which is fitting, because despite the intrigue, the scandals, and the political disasters, eunuchs were never really the center of the story. They were products of a system that demanded control above all else, a system that feared bloodlines, intimacy, and unpredictability. So it created servants who could not reproduce, who could not leave, who could be trusted, until they couldn't. And when the system died, it took them with it. The Forbidden City today is a museum. Tourists walk through the same corridors where eunuchs once waited silently. The rooms are bright, labeled, and safe. But for centuries, those halls were filled with men who had no exit, no family name to pass on, no grave guaranteed, just service. And that's the quiet ending to this story. Not a rebellion, not a purge, just a door closing, and no one left inside to hear it.
This is the real life of a whipping boy. And no, it's not a metaphor. It's exactly what it sounds like, which is already a problem. Before drifting too far into medieval nonsense, set the mood. This is not a loud story. There are no big battles, no heroic speeches, no dramatic last stands. This is a story about routine, etiquette, and adults making very confident decisions that make no sense at all, and about one unlucky child whose entire purpose was to be hit so someone else wouldn't be. Settle in, because tonight, history is quietly ridiculous. The idea of a whipping boy appears mostly in late medieval and early modern European courts, especially in England. The logic, if we're being generous, went like this. A prince is sacred, anointed by God, and must not be struck. But a prince is also a child, and children do dumb things. They talk back, skip lessons, poke servants with sticks, set small fires, and refuse to learn Latin. So instead of rethinking the system, the solution was simple. Hit a different child. Enter the whipping boy. He was usually the same age as the prince, often noble but not too noble, important enough to be educated alongside royalty, disposable enough to be punished. He lived, studied, played, and ate with the prince, and when the prince misbehaved, the whipping boy was whipped instead, publicly, painfully, sometimes daily. The theory was emotional leverage. The prince would feel so guilty watching his friends suffer that he'd behave better. This assumes the prince has empathy, blames himself instead of enjoying immunity, and that repeated exposure to violence teaches morality. Medieval education was wild. Whipping boys weren't slaves.
Their families received favor and protection, and some boys later received court positions. But the job was still being hit for things you didn't do. A lot. The most famous whipping boy was William Murray, who served Prince Charles, later Charles I of England. They grew up together with the same lessons and expectations, except when Charles messed up, William paid for it with his skin. Sources romanticize their bond, but imagine being 10 years old, knowing a forgotten prayer by someone else means you get whipped. Defenders insist punishments were symbolic and controlled, but corporal punishment then was not gentle. Pain was believed to sharpen memory, silence was cooperation. When a whipping boy was punished, it was a lesson for everyone watching. He lived under constant surveillance because his behavior supposedly reflected on the prince. If the prince was lazy, rebellious, or cruel, the blame somehow landed on the whipping boy, and they just kept hitting the other kid. Stranger still, whipping boys were expected to correct the prince, advise him, and steer him toward obedience, trapping them in a permanent paradox. Correct him too much and annoy him, too little and get punished, be ignored and it's still your fault. Some princes felt guilt and begged for punishments to stop. Others learned that rules applied to others and pain was transferable. Daily life meant early lessons, long hours, no tolerance for distraction. The prince yawns, the whipping boy stiffens. The prince whispers, the whipping boy braces. This created intense emotional dependency, resentment, numbness, or quiet endurance. Many whipping boys didn't immediately stop being punished when the prince grew up. Some were reassigned or dismissed quietly with rewards and warnings. There are few first-person accounts because history was written by people who weren't getting hit. The practice lingered into the 17th century, and when it produced unstable rulers, no one connected the dots. Did it work? Not really. If the goal was moral, empathetic leadership, results were mixed at best. Charles I later rewarded William Murray with titles and land, but still believed in absolute monarchy, ignored parliament, escalated conflicts, and lost a civil war and his head. Other princes grew crueler and detached. As Enlightenment ideas spread, educators questioned the system, suggesting radically that princes be disciplined directly or even talked to. Slowly, the practice faded, not because it was recognized as cruel, but because the idea of sacred royal bodies collapsed. Once kings could be corrected, there was no need to hit someone else. The whipping boy disappeared quietly, without apology or memorials, fitting for a role designed to absorb pain silently. We talked about the basic idea of a whipping boy, a job invented by people who thought empathy could be outsourced. Now we linger a little longer inside the emotional mess of it all, because the most interesting part of the whipping boy system wasn't the punishment itself, it was the relationship it created. A relationship that was complicated, quietly intense, and extremely unhealthy. The supposed goal was friendship. Royal tutors and court thinkers loved the idea that a prince and his whipping boy would become inseparable. Raised together, educated together, emotionally bonded. The whipping boy wasn't just a human punching bag, he was meant to be a mirror. If the prince saw his friend suffer, the thinking went, he would feel shame, and shame would lead to virtue. Which sounds nice, in the same way medieval medicine sounded nice right up until the leeches came out. In practice, this friendship was built on imbalance. The prince had power by birth, while the whipping boy had proximity but no authority. They wore similar clothes, shared meals, and recited the same lessons, but one of them could never forget his place. Imagine playing a game with someone who knows the rules don't apply to them, every move careful, every joke measured, every disagreement risky. That isn't friendship, that's survival with a smile. And yet, many whipping boys did genuinely care for their princes, because children bond easily, especially when isolated together. Royal childhoods were lonely. Princes were kept away from common children, surrounded by adults, watched constantly, and the whipping boy was often the only peer who stayed. So when punishment came, emotions tangled. Some princes cried, some begged tutors to stop, some promised to behave better, while others learned to compartmentalize, looking away, going still, accepting punishment as routine. That's where things get quietly unsettling, because emotional distance is a skill, and once learned, it doesn't stay confined to childhood. There's a reason so many monarchs are described as cold, detached, unmoved by suffering. They were trained early to watch pain without intervening. Consider Prince Edward, son of Henry VIII. Edward VI became king at the age of 9, already too young to manage an empire.
Let alone personal trauma. There's no definitive record of him having a formal whipping boy, but he was raised in an environment where corporal punishment was routine and royal exceptionalism absolute. Discipline existed, but it was filtered. Edward was fragile, sickly, constantly monitored, and while tutors corrected him, they did so carefully, always aware this was a future king. Any harsh discipline was often redirected, servants dismissed, tutors blamed, others punished. The pattern remained the same. Pain had to land somewhere, just not on the royal body. Widening the lens, the whipping boy system wasn't just about discipline, it was about reinforcing hierarchy. Everyone in the room learned something. The prince learned he was untouchable, the whipping boy learned he was replaceable, and the court learned where power lived. This lesson repeated daily, and repetition is how systems stick. Ironically, enormous effort went into protecting princes while completely ignoring their emotional development. They were trained to rule, not to feel, and when feelings did surface, anger, fear, insecurity, they were often externalized, blamed on others, and punished through proxies. When childhood ended, the futures of whipping boys were uneven. Some were rewarded, with William Murray standing as the rare shining example who remained close to Charles I and gained titles, influence, and security. But most simply faded from the record, returning to lesser noble lives, taking minor court positions, entering the clergy, or disappearing entirely. They carried something invisible with them, because being punished for someone else's mistakes rewires how responsibility feels. Fairness becomes optional, outcomes detach from actions, and pain feels arbitrary, hardly a recipe for emotional stability. There are only hints in letters and later accounts, men who were unusually compliant, overly deferential, or deeply resentful of authority. Some became fiercely loyal to monarchy, others avoided court life altogether. History never really asked how they felt. The broader culture made this possible. Medieval and early modern societies believed hierarchy was natural, God-ordained, immutable. Suffering wasn't a problem to solve, just a condition to manage, and if someone had to suffer, better them than the king. The whipping boy embodied that logic perfectly, a single body absorbing discomfort so the system could remain intact. In that way, the practice feels strangely modern. Consequences are still redirected, elites still shielded, proxies still found. We just don't call them whipping boys anymore. There's a popular myth that whipping boys were fictional, a literary invention. While the term is exaggerated in novels and dramatized for effect, the practice itself was real and documented in court records and correspondence. What's exaggerated is the emotional payoff. Stories like to tell us princes learned kindness, guilt transformed them, and friendship triumphed. Reality was quieter. Sometimes restraint was learned, sometimes nothing changed, and sometimes cruelty was simply normalized, which is often the most historically accurate outcome. Imagine a single moment, a classroom with stone walls and a cold floor. A tutor asks a question, the prince shrugs, silence stretches, and the tutor sighs. Everyone knows what comes next. The whipping boy stands and steps forward, already familiar with the routine, while the prince watches, not shocked, not outraged, just waiting.
That moment repeats hundreds of times, and moments like that shape people, rulers, servants, and the emotional tone of an entire court. The quiet legacy of the whipping boy is this: it didn't end cruelty, it redistributed it. It didn't teach accountability, it taught insulation. It didn't disappear because people became kinder, but because monarchy became less sacred. Once kings could be punished directly through law, exile, or execution, the logic collapsed. You don't need a whipping boy when the king himself can lose his crown. The transition was messy, violent, and deeply uncomfortable, but it marked the end of a very specific injustice, one that hid behind politeness and tradition. And finally, the whipping boy wasn't only a victim, he was also a witness. He saw power up close, learned its habits, insecurities, and fragility, and some of those boys grew into men who understood monarchy better than the monarchs themselves. Quiet observers, scarred advisors, living reminders that power always costs someone something. We talked about the emotional shape of the whipping boy system, how it trained princes to watch pain without stepping in, and how the boys themselves carried consequences they didn't earn. Now the view widens, because the whipping boy wasn't an isolated oddity, it was part of a much larger idea. The idea that some people are too important to suffer directly. That idea appears everywhere, in royal courts, in religious rituals, and in political systems. The whipping boy was simply the most literal, visible version of it. If we step outside England for a moment, the same structure appears in different forms. In France, the term souffre-douleur shows up occasionally in court language, literally meaning pain bearer, a phrase already says too much. French princes were treated as semi-sacred, anointed, and divinely favored, so direct physical punishment was rare. Discipline still existed, but it was indirect. Tutors were punished, servants dismissed, companions removed. The child felt consequences emotionally rather than physically, which sounds gentler until you realize it taught the same lesson. My mistakes hurt other people. Not in a way that encouraged responsibility, but in a way that encouraged distance. In some German courts, young princes were subjected to extreme discipline framed as moral training rather than punishment. Long prayers, cold rooms, silent meals, pain without blows, symbolic suffering. Again, the body of the ruler was protected, but discomfort still needed an outlet. If we float even farther to ancient Japan, noble children were also shielded from direct punishment. Attendants were held responsible for their behavior instead. If a young lord failed etiquette, an attendant might be punished, dismissed, shamed, or worse. Different culture, same structure. Pain redirected downward. This isn't about medieval cruelty specifically, it's about hierarchy. Wherever power is untouchable, someone else absorbs the impact. The whipping boy simply made that reality visible. On a personal level, growing up knowing your pain exists for someone else's moral education does something lasting. There's a modern psychological term for it, but we don't need it.
Simply put, it teaches that your body is a tool, your feelings are secondary, and your suffering is useful. And usefulness can be dangerous. Some whipping boys internalized this deeply, becoming people pleasers, fixers, and buffers who step in front of conflict automatically, not because they want to, but because it feels familiar. Others moved in the opposite direction, becoming detached, cynical, and unimpressed by authority, because once you've been punished for someone else's sins, moral theater stops working. Age matters here. Most whipping boys were very young, 7, 8, 9, precisely when the brain is learning what cause and effect feel like. For them, cause and effect were scrambled. They didn't do the thing, but they received the pain, again and again. Over time, the world stopped making sense in small but lasting ways. That confusion could follow them for life. Some later defended the system, calling it honorable, necessary, or character building. This isn't surprising. People often rationalize what they survive. If something hurt deeply, it's easier to believe it had meaning. And courts were very good at supplying meaning. You suffer so the prince may learn. You serve the future of the realm. Your pain protects the crown. Big ideas placed on small shoulders. The idea of the whipping boy never disappeared. It survived metaphorically. We still use the terms scapegoat, fall guy, whipping boy, someone blamed, punished, or humiliated so the system itself doesn't have to change. When you trace those ideas back, they almost always lead to power protecting itself. Now imagine the prince again, grown older, remembering those punishments and the friend who suffered because of him. That memory can produce guilt, or it can produce justification. I didn't ask for this. This is just how things are. They knew the role. Justification is easier, especially when everyone around you reinforces it. Courts didn't encourage reflection, they encouraged continuity, tradition over introspection. Picture an adult king years later, surrounded by advisors, making decisions that affect lives, displace families, and start or avoid wars. Somewhere deep in memory is that classroom, that boy stepping forward, that sound. Whether the king notices it or not, that memory shapes him, because leadership is learned, not innate, and early lessons last. The quietest tragedy is that whipping boys rarely had the language to explain what happened to them. There was no therapy, no honest journals, no one asking how it felt, only expectations to endure, be loyal, and not complain. That's why their stories feel thin. We know dates, names, and appointments, but not their inner lives. And that absence is part of the harm. History remembers power loudly and suffering softly, sometimes not at all. As the Enlightenment crept in, attitudes slowly shifted. Thinkers began questioning inherited authority, education, and child rearing. Figures like John Locke suggested children weren't born sinful but shaped by experience, which posed a problem for systems built on ritual punishment. If children are shaped by what they witness, then watching your friend get beaten might shape you too, and not in ways anyone intended. Gradually, whipping boys faded away, not because people suddenly became kinder, but because the system proved inefficient. It didn't reliably produce obedient, stable rulers. And that, more than morality, is usually why systems change. Now we can gently prepare to move forward. In later centuries, especially the 18th and 19th, writers rediscovered the idea, and they loved it. Victorian authors in particular found the whipping boy irresistible. It had everything they enjoyed: moral lessons, friendship across class lines, suffering with purpose, and a tidy emotional arc. In these retellings, the whipping boy is noble, patient, almost saintly. The prince is flawed but redeemable, touched by guilt and changed by empathy. And the punishment itself becomes vague, reduced to implication, suggestion, or symbolism. The pain fades into the background, softened by meaning. Which is how uncomfortable history often gets rewritten. Because real whipping boys were not symbols. They were children with bodies, and those bodies remembered. But fiction prefers meaning over mess, so the story shifts. The whipping boy becomes a lesson about kindness, about shared humanity, about friendship triumphing over hierarchy. It is a comforting story, just not an accurate one. In reality, the system didn't collapse because princes became kinder. It collapsed because monarchy lost its untouchable status. Once kings could be criticized, constrained, or removed, the entire logic unraveled. You don't need symbolic punishment when real accountability exists. And that transition was anything but gentle. Revolutions, executions, exile. The price of equality was very loud. Compared to that chaos, the whipping boy fades quietly. No apology, no reckoning, just absence. Which mirrors how those boys lived. They were present when needed and invisible when not. And that is the final irony. The whipping boy existed to protect the image of the prince, to preserve the illusion of divine perfection. But in doing so, he revealed something deeply human about power. Power hates consequences, and when it can't avoid them, it redirects them. That is true in royal courts. That is true in governments. That is true in families. That is true in workplaces. The names change, the costumes change, but the structure stays familiar. Someone makes a mistake, someone else pays, and the system continues. So when we talk about whipping boys today, we usually mean it metaphorically. A scapegoat, a fall guy. But it is worth remembering that once it was literal. A small boy standing still, waiting, because someone important forgot a lesson. There is no grand ending for him, no dramatic exit. He grows up, moves on, carries what he carries, and history doesn't check in. Which brings us to now, to this quiet moment. Lights dim, breathing slow. Stories like this don't need conclusions, they just need remembering. Not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. So tonight, let this one drift away gently. No lessons demanded, no morals shouted. Just the awareness that power has always been cushioned, and someone has always been underneath. That's all for this story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening slowly. Wherever you are, let your shoulders relax. Let the day loosen its grip. And when sleep comes, let it come easily. Good night.